Excellent. So we can start. Have you read all the essays and all the reviews? All right, so you didn't have to read all the reviews. You just need to read the essays. So we can discuss the essays and also discuss the reviews. So IXC, and that was 06 2019. There were some glitches with the software. Some bugs were found, but most of the things were working okay. So if you find something that is, yeah, I have to log in actually.
I didn't succeed in saving the review. I tried a few times today, but I couldn't upload it.
Okay, have you log out and log in?
Yeah.
And do you have an error message?
No.
Do you know how to get the error message? So you have to go to like some.
Like to create a new issue, or
No, so like in the JavaScript console, you will have an exception or something that tells you why some things are not working. Not everything is communicated to the user, but it is communicated to the developer. It's yeah, the drawback of the.
Okay, I will try one more time.
Yeah, I have to actually change the browser because I'm different user. So yeah, there was somebody else who had a problem with saving, and it turned out that it's basically expired token. So if you log in and log out, it will fix that. We need to do that like automatically, but it's not done yet. Okay. So who would like to go first? Whose essay should we discuss? Any volunteers?
Might as well just get it over with.
Okay. So your one is your one we have to see here. So maybe you start and you tell us a little bit about the motivation and the purpose of the essay, and then people will kind of comment whether you achieved what you set yourself up to. Yep.
So this wasn't what I originally wanted to. The article I originally wanted to write. Basically, the problem that I had was that I originally wanted to write about sort of like which frameworks, etc., would you go for if you wanted high performance, or yeah, between different frameworks for application development, preferably compared to native implementations.
Yep.
And the problem I had was that I didn't really find that much literature on the topic, and what I found wasn't necessarily that great. And it often left me with a bunch of questions that were never really answered, which about the quality of the different benchmarks, etc., that were done, which then turned to why I wrote sort of like, here are some problems that you face when looking into mobile performance studies, and what you perhaps should be on the lookout for, because it would be nice if these things were given. So it's sort of me both whining and at the same time trying to say like this is stuff that it would be nice to have, when you're actually performing a benchmark study. Or not necessarily just nice to have, but in sometimes like really, it's really important.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, it deals with repetition numbers, basically information about repeatability and access to code, etc.
Mm-hmm.
And what sort of implementations that has been done, which is the last part, which is comparative amount of work, which is a point that's not argued well
Mm-hmm.
At all. But yeah, and basically what I sort of want to get across is we sort of need access to all the source code and all the stuff that were done to measure and basically do the benchmark.
Mm-hmm.
Without it, it's sort of hard to evaluate the validity of the benchmark and also the sort of how realistic the benchmarks are, etc.
Yeah.
Yeah. Basically, I conclude that usually when comparing native code to high code or high-level code, or also sort of like in general, benchmarking is hard and it should be sort of taken with pinches of salt, especially when comparing relatively different applications, etc. And just the problem that modern hardware is really complex.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard to get deterministic results, etc.
Okay. References. Yep. So have you read the review?
Yep.
And what do you think about the review?
Way too positive. The main thing that that the review picks up on is that the reviewer doesn't really follow the argument about comparing sort of comparability of work.
Mm-hmm.
And I see why they say that, because that section is not particularly like I didn't get across what I was actually trying to argue, which is so it's the on the next page though, the part I'm thinking about.
Yep.
Comparability. It claims that it might not be valid to compare native implementation to an implementation using a high-level framework, and he says that he doesn't not sure if he follows the point being argued, because while it might not be fair to compare it to implementations of a specific problem, isn't it fair to compare how well they solve the problem, even though the implementation is different? And I take that on my as my mistake, because that's not what I'm trying to argue, but I see why he saw it that way. Or it might be that he also saw it correctly, but basically what I'm trying to argue was if you have this high-level framework that you are using in a very specific way, because it's sort of mandated by the framework, that framework will do a bunch of optimizations based on that, based on how it knows you will be using it. A general-purpose compiler can't do those optimizations because it doesn't have all those assumptions. And so there you sort of, if you're not, so for instance, in a high-level framework, let's say you're doing web app, if you're comparing a web application, which is just parsing HTML documents, sort of versus a whole life cycle management that goes through a native app, also especially if it's not sort of implemented necessarily with speed in mind, then those are two, like, sure, they're two different solutions, but they're also two widely different solutions. And how, I mean, obviously one is going to be faster than the other, so I'm sort of like, what's the, is it still correct to compare, or yeah, it's still correct to compare them, but how sort of relevant is it? Like, is it like comparing like a linear search versus a binary search? It's, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know if I got the point because now either it's sort of hard to try and get across, but I totally see why that criticism is there, and it's totally justified.
So what others think? Can you compare a native implementation to an implementation based on high-level framework? What are the challenges? What are the problems when doing that? So you have one implementation which is like native, let's say on Android, and one which is using some sort of a high-level framework for doing things on Android. And you've implemented similar functionality or the same functionality on both. Can you now compare them, which one is faster and which one isn't? Is the comparison meaningful? So from one hand, we have a claim that the comparison is like apple and oranges. It's like you should not do that. On the other hand, it's like, why not? You can still compare which one is faster. You can still say, yeah, this one actually works faster or uses less memory or whatever. You can have some metrics comparing them. And the metrics are objective. The question is the comparison meaningful? Can you compare those two things? Someone else than PMS.
Afterwards, I will reiterate.
Yeah. So what do you think? Like when you would be in charge of doing a research on some sort of performance metrics, comparing native applications to some hybrid or framework-based, methodology-wise, would it be okay to do those kind of comparisons?
There are a few differences with the performance. Like with the native, it's faster, and the compiled application is much smaller in size somehow. And with the other programming, it's very big for the same functionalities. Because we have to compile all the functionality to the Android compatible, and also like we tried once, so from like it was just displaying pictures, and it was even like lagging in like very latest Android devices with the high performance language, but the same application was working fine with the native language.
Yeah. You can comment?
On that?
No, in general.
Yeah. No, the point was more, there was just one, the point was, is the code written in a way that suits the paradigm and framework that is used? So in the framework, it forces you to write in that paradigm.
Yeah.
But if you're doing it natively, then you also have a lot more freedom, which then comes to the question: are you writing that in a way that do you write it with sort of performance in mind, etc.? So, for instance, the one of the studies, while it was flawed, it actually had the good methodology of going out to by comparing performance not on their own implementation, but finding like an open source project that was made specifically for comparing different application frameworks. So they implemented the same functionality everywhere using different frameworks, and sort of the strength of that is that there were like every implementation was implemented by someone who knew that framework.
In the spirit of the framework.
In the spirit of the framework, and with the knowledge of how to use that framework, and that's the same goes then also for the native implementation. So it's not like you're naively implementing it natively while the framework does a bunch of stuff because they know how it's used.
Yeah.
And in that case, I don't think those two are necessarily comparable.
Yeah. So in fact, it is a complex matrix. So what you're talking about is one kind of dimension, and then comparing native versus frameworks in general is another dimension, right? So sometimes you have comparisons like you described, that there is a framework which has been re-implemented with the spirit and with the kind of, how they call it, like a way of the working of the framework. So someone with the inside knowledge of a particular language or particular framework kind of implements it so it's aligned with the framework itself, and then you compare those two re-implementations, or you have exactly same code, same loops or whatever, and you say, okay, is it working here the same as here? And here meaning the native code where you have the freedom of doing that, and here meaning it doesn't fit because you're doing something that is not along with the framework. So you're doing it at the service potentially. You're kind of handicapping the implementation because you're not taking advantage of what the framework offers. So those are kind of two different axes, right? And the problem space is hard. I've seen studies doing one or the other, and it kind of doesn't matter really as long as you can pinpoint why you have some results, right? So you can, for example, have some complex calculations done in Java and have exactly same loops and same calculations done in C++ and in JavaScript. And then you package it up into 3 different Android apps. And one is using the web framework with the JavaScript interpreter, one is using the Java, and one is using native C++, right? And then you have some results, whatever the results are. And it doesn't matter whatever the results are, because what matters is why you got those results. So if you can explain why C++ is faster or slower than Java, then that's meaningful outcome of the comparison. If you say, Java took 10 seconds and C++ took 9 seconds. What does it tell me? I don't know what does it tell me. Is Java really slower than C++? Maybe, but if I don't know the reason, I may do something else hoping that C++ will be faster and it will turn out to be slower because I'm not using what made this particular thing go faster. So for all those kind of discussions, I think the raw numbers are actually secondary. What is primary is why things are this way, right? So if I can pinpoint that on average, WebView interpreter of JavaScript is so-and-so slower than the native execution of the binary of the machine code on Android, it gives me some hints, right? I can have some predictions saying, okay, if I do exactly same piece of code in JavaScript, it probably will be a little bit slower or will use probably more memory because of the properties of the WebView interpreter. With a different interpretation, it might be different, right? And with the native, the same. Like if I'm using some libraries and I have to marshal and unmarshal the C++ into some sort of a Java, then C++ will be slower from, compared to Java. But if I'm doing the opposite, then Java will be slower. So if I can pinpoint exactly why some results are obtained, then it will kind of give you the outcome that the reader or the researcher is looking for. So can you compare? The answer to that is yes and no. I think you can. I think you can take different things and compare them and then pinpoint that actually this is a bit slower because you didn't use the framework features. If you did use the framework features, it would be a little bit faster. How it compares to this, again, it's kind of a complex space, all right? So your comment that in general frameworks use more memory and are slower, it's sort of based on some sampling of some sort of studies that were done on a number of cases, and that's true, right? In general, if I have to have a loop and I do it in C++, it will marginally run faster than Java. With the exception that if I'm doing something with UI or if I'm doing something with the Android, services or artifacts, the C++ will be slower because in Java I don't have to marshal and unmarshal things to talk to the native libraries which are optimized to work with Java. And some of them only have sort of a Java interface. Google was working on porting most of the things to have a C++ equivalent, so you can avoid that that step, that cross-language barrier. So a lot of things like Google Play, for example, Google Games also, they have now C++ header files and APIs that allow you to kind of cross-cut directly into the native implementations. But for a long time, if you were doing anything with activity or with the UI, you have to go through Java. and then your C++ wouldn't be faster. It would actually be slower, right? If you're just doing calculations, yeah, often it's the same. Marginally is faster. And also, you know, it depends how you're counting the Java time, because Java needs to be compiled, right? So if you're counting how long a certain loop takes with the compilation step or without it, you know, the Java code has been already compiled into the machine code, right? So sometimes if you run something for the first time, it's a little bit slower with Java, but if you subsequently run it over and over, it is at full speed because it's already been compiled into machine code. With the modern frameworks of ahead-of-time compilations and just-in-time compilations, sometimes you don't know when the compilation actually happens. So when you're measuring the time, you know, you may end up measuring the compiled execution, or you might be measuring the compilation plus the execution, right? So those are little nuances that influence the outcomes. And if you just give me a number, I have a lot of questions. If you tell me what happened and what took how much, then that is what I need. That kind of communicates what actually insights I'm looking for. So it is a complex issue. And I think kind of having a discussion on it is good, like both from the review and from your end, that re-implementing it in a particular framework way is important. What is probably missing in the essay is clarity of what is what and explanation that you took that into consideration, right? So this suggests that there was some communication between you and the reader, right? Yeah. Anything else from the review? So based on the review, you would change that bit. You would be kind of a clearer here. What else? What other changes you would make? Overall, you happy, right? And the reviewer was happy. Yeah. So you sort of achieved your goal with some improvement of communicating what you had in your head.
Yeah. There's nothing really in there that I disagree with.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, again, I think it's a bit too positive, but that's
okay.
Self-criticism. Yeah. So
yeah.
I'm not really sure about the empirical basis for the paper. Like, that's sort of a question why that's there.
So
because no data was collected.
Yeah, that's true. So so how would you address that?
I don't know. I wasn't planning on collecting any data. Like, yeah. I'm not sure if I think that's really applicable. If that category is really applicable.
So what others think? So it is a study based on lit review. So PMS reviewed some articles and he judged the way they've done the sort of a performance analysis. So he was not measuring anything himself. He was not running any comparison of the native versus framework code. He was just basing his conclusions or his points on somebody else's studies. So how would you address the empirical basis for the paper in this case? Yeah?
Yeah, I was also doing the whole thing from the template when I was reviewing.
Yeah.
And I also scored 1 for empirical basis of the paper, but I was not thinking that as, I was just interpreting that as a neutral score, like no data was collected, like but it is a rating, so it should perhaps not be used like that.
Yeah.
But that template doesn't really apply to essays like this. I don't think it applies to any of the essays we are writing.
That's right. So
maybe we should leave some of those scores out.
So that's one interpretation of that point. You might say, well, actually, it is sort of a review paper. Therefore, you know, in the review paper, you're not gonna collect data. Therefore, this point is irrelevant, right? So that's one interpretation.
However, one thing I do know is
yeah.
that I went and looked for papers. We could interpret data to say that, you know, I don't actually supply how I got the papers that I got.
Exactly. So we've discussed it in one of the sessions that when you're doing a review paper, you kind of can collect data about the process of how you've collected those papers, right? So let's say I want to make a claim. I don't know. Let's make some ridiculous claim that if you let's say I claim that if you cut down on sugar consumption, you will reduce the obesity problem, right? Let's say that's my claim. I will find 3 papers which agree exactly with what I'm saying, and I will cite them, and I will say, well, my point is proven. Will my point be proven? Why not? Sorry? You can cherry pick, exactly. And there might be 300 other papers which say the opposite to what those 3 papers say, right? But we don't know, right? It might be the opposite. I might have cherry picked something that is true, right? So there might be 300 papers which say that's true, and I just cherry pick 3 of them. And there are, let's say, 3 other papers which say something opposite to those 3 papers, but those are the only 3 papers which say the opposite, right? So I have 300 versus 3, right, ratio. But if we don't have this data, we don't know the weight of the argument. So I normally interpret that point, even for the review papers, as kind of the work that the researcher done to make it easier to judge the claims, right? So when PMS has, so in his essay, I have 4 references. How do I know that those are representative of those 300 papers that are, they are the weight of the body of the work, right? How did you find them? Have you cherry picked them, or can I reproduce this process? Is the process objective? If I reproduce the process, I will end up with the same papers, right? Or do I have to cherry pick, right? Cherry picking is, considered bad, right? So if you kind of a cherry picking, you have to have reasons why are you cherry picking. And so, let's say he did review a number of papers and he picked those 4 because they were most representative, right? And that's fine, but you don't have that discussion. Yeah. You don't have that data, right?
So it's annoying because I did actually take those notes. So I don't know why I didn't include it. Yeah,
exactly. So if you did include it, then you would score higher on that thing. You can say, this is an let's say a neutral point for the review papers, but usually that's not the case. Usually, even for the review papers, that point is considered not neutral if it's not done. You should do it even for the review papers, right? As you say, you took some notes, you did run some notes of how you found the papers and why you picked those as a representative sample. There might be hundreds of papers. You cannot review hundreds of papers in a short essay. You have to cherry pick, but we want to see if the cherry picking process was kind of legitimate, if you didn't skew the process to have your point across, right? We want this process to be objective and repeatable, right? So if I cherry pick different 4 papers following the criteria that you've used, will I end up with similar conclusions? And the hope is that yes. If I pick another 4 papers from the domain the way you've picked those 4, I will end up with similar conclusions to yours, right? And if you haven't done this kind of a data analysis about how you've done it, I cannot redo it, and I cannot really trust it, right? Because you can, as we were discussing, it's possible to have arbitrary outcome based on arbitrary papers. There are papers written for everything, like, in 60s or in 50s, there was a lot of people saying smoking is healthy. Like, you should actually smoke. There was a lot of research done with empirical evidence that smoking is a very healthy thing. It increases your, heart rate or reduces your heart rate. You become more relaxed, and, it reduces stress, which is good. You will live longer, right? And we know now, sure, it's like a handful of papers which claim that, and you have thousands of papers which say the other thing, right? And now we see a better picture of what that space is like, right? It's similar with the radiation of your smartphone or kind of a transmitter receiver, right? There is a lot of studies saying that it is negative, and there is a lot of studies saying, well, it is negative, but it's so small negative that we can disregard it, right? Which ones are correct? Well, we don't know yet. We don't have enough evidence to say, you know, one way or the other. We definitely know that radiation causes mutations in the gene expressions and can cause cancer and can cause developmental failures in the cells that are still developing, right? We know those are facts, right? For sure. How significant it is when you're kind of talking on the phone? Well, some papers suggest that it's actually quite significant, right? So there are recommendations that when you're talking on the phone, you shouldn't press the headset to your head. You should kind of have it a little bit away, right? So there are some safety recommendations, right? But, you know, what's at stake? Well, we use phones. We like using phones. Manufacturers like you buying phones. There is a huge industry. So if now the recommendation is, well, it's actually so dangerous that you shouldn't use it, we should sort of ban it, it would have, you know, significant implications on everything, right? So making this kind of judgment is taken with a grain of salt, even for smoking, right? We know, I mean, smoking is kind of bad. There is no real good things about smoking. The relaxation effects are better achieved through other means than smoking, because the negative aspects of smoking are so bad that, you know, it doesn't justify the positive, right? So why do we still have cigarettes and smoking? Well, you know, there is an industry, there is the freedom of people doing whatever they want, but we have to inform them. And you have all those advertisements on the packs of cigarettes about the dangers, right? There was a huge discussion in Australia because in a lot of countries they introduced the law that the cigarette packaging has to be kind of non-branded, right? We ended up having a white packs of cigarettes with just a brand name and some pictures of effects of smoking, but the companies cannot express their branding. You used to have those very fancy cigarette packaging with a camel or something, which kind of associate smoking with a lot of positive things, right? And this branding was judged by a lot of studies that this branding influences teenagers and kids to associate smoking with kind of positive thing and kind of introduces people to smoking, which of course the tobacco companies wanted, right? But it was sort of judged that if smoking is an expression of your maturity and your decision that you will smoke, because you should have the right to decide that, then the branding aspect should be taken away, because it's sort of manipulating the perception of what smoking is, especially for the kids and teenagers. So in a lot of countries, they kind of agreed that, okay, let's do it's kind of like white label branding. The packets are so similar to each other that it doesn't matter. It doesn't convey this branding phenomena, right? But in Australia, tobacco companies were suing the government saying, you forbid us to use the branding and you don't forbid any other companies to use the branding. Why, right? So it's kind of unfair, right? Yeah, it is kind of unfair, but, you know, the research suggests that that's kind of a good way to do it, to prevent kind of teenagers to get into smoking, right? So you have, you know, as an academic, you may have a very clear answer, like, okay, smoking is bad, let's just ban it, right? When you say, doing that in coding is bad, it uses more RAM, it's slower, don't do it, and we don't do it, right? You have some recommendations and everybody sort of accepts the better outcome is kind of not do certain things or do certain things certain way. With society, you have a lot of additional constraints or considerations to take. Okay, how we ended up talking about smoking? Oh yeah, that you can prove whatever point you want to prove by having picked publications about that, right? So when you're doing review, you do have to collect data and you have to provide kind of an evidence by your data of how the process is repeatable, that you didn't cherry pick something to just force the reader to your point of view. So in that point, even for all the essays that we currently done, it should be somehow qualitatively or quantitatively argued that the selection is legitimate and it's representative, right? Why would you achieve that? So let's say you only have a space for 4 references. How would you make it such that it's representative? So how did you pick those 4?
So I did a bunch of different queries in both the IEEE index database and the ACM index database, and also in Google Scholar so afterwards. And seeing as I started doing sort of writing another article first, I basically looked for performance analysis studies on frameworks in general, and then I tried finding the ones that were comparison studies that included, because I originally wanted to do 3 different frameworks, or native and 2 frameworks.
Yeah.
And then I tried to identify what was the most common frameworks and sort of pick the articles that I could find, because there wasn't really that many that used the 2 popular frameworks compared with a native implementation, and possibly also more frameworks, because there were some that did a bunch of that.
Yep.
And then after having looked through all of those and without being able to sort of get the points I wanted, I had also then at that point read through them and had some notes about, like, I don't get this to make sense, sort of. So yeah, I didn't find what I was originally looking for, which is potentially a positive or a negative thing. So I sort of,
So
I didn't necessarily look for other papers on criticism of performance studies, which I also could have done, because this has probably been argued before.
Okay, so in your case, what happened was you had some data sources. So you had Google Scholar, Web of Science. What else have you used?
It was Google Scholar, the IEEE Index, and ACM.
Index and ACM and Google Scholar.
Usually Google Scholar led me to one of those others, which is why I started doing like more sort of direct search in IEEE and ACM, because they were the ones that kept showing up the most.
Arxiv is another one. So those are the typical ones that we use for computer science publications, right? Of course you can do Google as well, right? So you can kind of Google it, but
there was mostly blog posts there, and
exactly
the same problems as the studies had.
So this is good for blogs, for white papers, and also for sometimes it is relevant for patents, right? So you can do some searches with Google, but you will usually end up in that space. It's kind of much easier to find publication articles using the other ones, right? So Google Scholar, IEEE Index, ACM, Web of Science, or Arxiv, they are all very good. So once you do the search, you have 2 things. You have keywords you've used, right? So you record the keywords you've used, and you record the size of the corpus which the keywords give you, right? So you say, when I did those keywords in Google Scholar, with Google Scholar it's sort of tricky. It doesn't give you the kind of a single size, but with those they give you kind of a size. They tell you, okay, it's 1 of 30, or 1 of 1,000, or 1 of 30,000, right? So this is important, because if you found something out of 30,000, you know you're too broad, right? Your keywords are too broad. You have to narrow it down, right?
It was usually in the like a couple of, like in the hundreds, and still containing some stuff that I didn't really find relevant.
Exactly.
So like, mainly I look for like mobile development framework and hybrid development framework plus performance and trying to set up Boolean fields.
Exactly. So what we're trying to do with the keywords, we're trying to limit of what we're gonna get, right? So usually you start with something that gives you too much and it contains a lot of irrelevant stuff. So then you kind of remove kind of irrelevant things and you improve the relevant things, right? So you try to make a query which highlights all the relevant bits and kind of diminish all the irrelevant ones. So you do some initial filtering, right? You want this to be manageable, right? You want this to be relatively smallish, right? So in kind of hundreds, right? Range. Can you do a master thesis with hundreds of papers being reviewed? You cannot, right? So, but that's your basis, right? So the first step is run some queries initially, but then you will kind of scan the papers and say, yeah, this is irrelevant, why this is irrelevant, and came up with the query, right? So you review your keywords and you review your constraints and kind of end up with something which is in hundreds, right? Which is mostly relevant. Again, you will have some irrelevant stuff in there, right? It's impossible to run a query that only has relevant things. So unless, you know, you will have to deal with a little bit of noise here. And then, so that's the first step. So the first step is the keywords and size. The second step is you do some filtering, right? So now you say, okay, once I have this, I will have some irrelevant things which I couldn't filter out, right? So, you know, the irrelevant ones are there, but you want not to talk about them, right? And then with the rest, what's in there? So you will have kind of highly relevant bits and kind of less relevant bits. How you get to the highly relevant ones? You have to use some criteria, and it can be anything, right? It can be additional keyword search. It can be additional keyword search on abstracts. It can be something that you've used, right? But you can document that. You can document what criteria you've used to narrow it down to the kind of a subset. Sometimes it can be like a secondary keyword search. And you can do full text search, right? You don't know how those indexes work. Usually they have an ability to do full text search, but you can do it kind of yourself again. You can do things like citation index, right? What you can pick is you can say, okay, let's say I found out 100 papers on Google Scholar, the first 100, and I sort them based on citation. And I take the first 20, which are the most cited ones, assuming that they are the most significant ones, right? So you can use citation index. You can use a year of publication, right?
Yeah.
So you can say, well, I will sort them in reverse publication order. I will take the most recent ones first, and then, you know, I don't really care what mobile performance was in 2013.
Yeah, because I just cut off at 2014.
I mean, at some point you just can cut off, right? So you can also have a cutoff, right? You can say everything below 2015, I don't care. I mean, you know, irrelevant. So then you end up with a kind of a smaller subset. And you want that to be kind of, you know, smaller than 100, right? You want something that you can kind of manage, right? And then you manage it manually. So you kind of scan it. You scan the titles, you scan the abstracts, you kind of do some sorting. And you say, okay, then you sort them. So that's the second step. And the third one is you sort of group them and sort them, right? So you may say, okay, some papers actually talk about this framework or that both frameworks. So two frameworks, only one of the two frameworks. Those we're talking about 2 frameworks plus native, right? He can do some sorting. So he can group them and he can have some sort of groupings. And then once he has this grouping, he can say, I actually picked papers only from one of the groupings, right? When we're doing it for tobacco, we end up saying,
positive use of tobacco, negative use of tobacco, and review papers, right? We will have papers which review other papers, right? So when we were to talk about performance analysis or tobacco, the review papers are the gold because they review a number of papers for us, right? So a review paper may be talking about 40 or 30 papers with some summary, and we can use it, right? So when we're doing review papers are the ones we want, right? Because then we delegate the work of sorting and dealing with all those publications to somebody else who already did the work. Great. So if we have like 3 of those papers, we're covering like hundreds of publications which they've done, right? So review papers are the ones which we really look for initially, but it depends what we're doing, right? Sometimes you're doing something specific, like he was doing a comparison of 2 web frameworks versus 1 native framework for mobile development. How likely there is that someone did the review? Well, very unlikely. Like if you find that 1 paper with the review, great, but it's very unlikely that there is a review paper about exactly that topic. So you will not have that category. So then the second one is like, okay, if someone did compare both, that's better than if they only did 1, right? Because they've already tried to have an experiment which compares both of the things I want to compare, right? If I have 1 paper doing 1 framework and 1 paper doing another framework, how can I compare the results? It's harder, right? So papers which do both, or both plus, so those were the review, those are the better papers, right? So again, you can say I've identified that only 5 or 15 papers did that, or whatever the number was, right? If the number is very low, then you use all of them, right? You say I only found 4 papers which compare those 2 frameworks, and I've reviewed all of them, right? If the number is 15 and you're doing master thesis, you probably should review all of them, right? If the number is 115, then it's too much. Then you have to be more selective, right? But you can document the process, and you can document how you end up with the X number of papers that you are reviewing. In the case of the essay, it's sort of let's say 2 to 8 or 2 to 10 or 3 to whatever. It's smallish number, right? For your master thesis, that number can be 50 to 100. If you have less than 50 citations in your master thesis, you're probably doing something wrong. Yeah?
So how much space would you say that would be preferable to allocate in an essay list like for doing this evaluation of the sources?
In the essay?
Yeah, in the essay.
A paragraph. Yeah. Not too much. Yeah. Some keyword list, some number. Because in his case, I only need to know those 4 papers out of what sample, right? Is it out of 400, which is really kind of bad, or is it out of 10 he found for that purpose, right? If he only found 6 and reviewed 4, like, okay, it's very significant study, right? But if there are 400 and you picked 4, then you have to say why those 4, right? But not much than a paragraph, not more than a paragraph. How much you have to spend on this in your master thesis, it depends on the problem at hand. So some master theses are kind of more experimental, and you're coming up with something novel based on your own experimentation, in which case this is a little bit less significant. Then it's a little bit shorter, and the description of your experimentation and what you've done will be more emphasized. But some of your projects will end up being kind of a contribution to a field which is sort of well established, and then doing that is significant part. It will be a big-ish chapter, right? And as I said, you kind of aim at a reasonable high number of. It's not hard to have 100 citations in your thesis. It's just that you don't want them to be general, kind of generic, right? You want them to be specific to the problem at hand. So out of those, maybe 10 or so will be general. Like you have to refer, like in his case, let's say you're doing something with performance, you have to refer some textbooks or some general terms about performance. And those are not specific to mobile or whatever. Those are kind of a generic references, some foundational references. You will have to have them, but the majority should be kind of specific to the problem at hand.
I have sort of a question. In this case, where I'm not really citing the, so this is sort of related to the formatting or writing.
Yeah.
Because I'm not really citing the papers that I'm criticizing. But I'm talking about them. Should they still show up in sort of like the citation list? Because I'm not taking direct knowledge.
Right, so you're not
From
directly citing...
their findings. I'm sort of, because I got a bit unsure about that, if I should, because for me it would be more natural to put the ones I'm criticizing in footnotes, rather than necessarily...
So how do you refer to them in the text? You kind
they
of...
are referred to, or everything's referred to the same, which isn't particularly good.
Okay.
So, like, for example, in one study, 3, the native implementation of the benchmark is missing.
Yeah.
And that is, I'm not citing that as a source directly. I'm talking more about it, if you get what I'm trying to say.
This is fine.
Okay.
Yeah. What do others think? Do you think that sort of, for example, in one study, number 3, the native implementation of the benchmark is missing? It's fine. Yeah.
Because it's not something that's sort of arguing my point. It's more sort of...
No, but that's fine. I mean, you are sort of highlighting what the reader, where the reader can find some more information or some basis of what your claims are, and you're kind of referring to it, and it's fine, right? There is a rule that if you don't refer to a citation in your text, you should not have it in the list of references, right? So in LaTeX and in Word, whatever, you can have something in references that you haven't referred in the text, and that's frowned upon. I'm not very religious about it, so when I'm reviewing master thesis, I don't check it, but I know some reviewers actually will check it and will tell you those 5 or 10 references you never cited in the text. Therefore, you will get kind of a negative feedback for doing that, right?
But how do you then deal with sort of bibliography or stuff that you have not, that sort of has pointed you in the right direction, but you haven't necessarily directly argued for something?
You don't reference it.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a kind of a bug in the process, right?
Okay, well in that case you shouldn't be called for pleasure for having it unsighted either, because that's the other part of that is, if I don't know where to cite it,
yeah,
so cite it, but
basically
then someone comes and say, you have something here that you haven't cited.
That's right. So again, it's a spectrum, right? It's a little bit soft. So so here is stuff that you've used, right? So you kind of produce this based on that stuff, right? And some things are obvious. So obviously, you've used stuff from that publication, you reference it, you cite it, right? Some things are kind of the opposite. So you've been inspired by something that you do something else. Then you cite it, then you say, oh yeah, and this person did that, or this paper did that, but I did something else, right? You cite it, right? Some things are kind of a gray area, right? So you've read a paper, you don't really use it, but it gave you some sort of ideas that you can use, right? So then you have to judge, like you have to make a call of how much you actually reuse from that idea. And then if you say, well, I actually kind of reused most of it, then you cite it as well, right? So then you kind of, you cite it. Some things are kind of completely irrelevant. You had a chat with your mom and you had an inspiration from it and you've used it. Yeah, of course, you're not gonna cite your mom, right? So all informal communication is kind of in that space. it used to be completely non-cited because it used to be mostly spoken conversations, right? But nowadays researchers have a lot of chat. You have Discord chat, or you have email chat with people, right? Which I had, for example, for my PhD, right? I had some communication with some other researchers over email, right? And in the email, the guy gave me some ideas and he gave me some hints, right? Which then, like, I used it in the thesis, but I felt not good not citing it, right? So, and you see that in some publications, you have something like, informal communication with such and such person, right? Or email communication with such and such person. So you can cite those things too as well, if it's significant. Like if it's an essay, no, but if it's your master thesis, maybe you can do that, right? So if you had some sort of a meaningful chat with somebody in your domain, and you get some inspiration from it, you can just cite it as you can either thank them and at the end with credits, you say, this work was not possible, and those people contributed, or you can say informal communication with such and such person over email, right? And I've seen that people doing that as well, right? But it's kind of up to your judgment. It is kind of a gray area where some of it, people will not call you on that, right? I mean, the reviewer will not call you on the informal stuff. They may call you on something that has been published, and they know about it, but you don't cite it, but you're obviously using it, right? So why would you not use something that a reviewer is aware of, and you're using and you're not citing? You're either not aware of it, which is bad, you should be aware of it in the head of the reviewer, or you're not reviewing it on purpose, which means you're kind of trying maybe to plagiarize something or whatever, right? In either case, it's kind of negative, right? So if there is something really clear that you're using which you're not citing, you probably should cite it, right? But as I said, for most things it's obvious. For some things, it's not that clear, right? And I had those cases like I read a bad paper, which had a terrible idea, and I kind of was doing the opposite to what the paper had. Should I cite it? No, I thought, I'm not going to cite a bad paper which I read, which kind of inspired me to do a good thing instead, because it makes no sense, right? And no reviewer will call me like, oh yeah, you're not citing that paper which is doing the opposite of what you're doing, which is a bad paper, right? So sometimes, the gray area is quite obvious, but sometimes you can discuss with your supervisor, and they may help you to make a judgment. But it is, there is no algorithm to do one way or the other, right? Yeah. In general, I kind of lean towards citing. So if you're kind of not sure, you borderline, just cite it. Just add a reference and say what's in the paper, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we went beyond the break. So let's have a short break, and then we talk maybe about one or two more. It took kind of a while to do just one.